Good morning, English 11. It's Mr. Johnson here. We're going to continue our theme of narratives of enslaved peoples. Today we're going to focus on a man named Frederick Douglass. Here's what you need to know about Frederick Douglass before we start reading today. So Frederick Douglass was born in his grandmother's cabin in 1818, and he was not actually born Frederick Douglass. He was actually born Frederick Bailey, and he took that name from his mother. His father isn't officially known, but we know that Frederick Douglass was half white, so some historians think that his father was probably his mother's master. Hard to tell, though. As many slaves did during this time, Frederick Douglass bounced around from a variety of different households and different working conditions. But Frederick Douglass got lucky. At about age 12, one of his mistresses took a special interest in teaching him how to read. This would become very important in his life later on. If you can't read, you can't express yourself. Now, of course, Frederick Douglass didn't get that lucky just yet. That particular mistress decided not to finish the job herself, but Frederick Douglass was able to teach himself how to read simply by watching other people write and trying to sound out words from the newspaper and the Bible. And he would go on to use that skill later in life, writing several autobiographies, one of which we're going to read a few excerpts from this week. But at this point, Frederick Douglass is still a slave. It wasn't until he was transferred yet again to another master. Edward Covey had a reputation for being a slave breaker. Frederick Douglass was beaten repeatedly on Edward Covey's farm. He said at one point that his body, mind, and spirit were broken by the end of that experience. Today and tomorrow, we're going to be reading just a few excerpts from his book, and I think you'll start to see for yourself just how harrowing this experience was. What follows is an excerpt from the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. I have already intimated that my condition was much worse during the first 6 months of my stay at Mr. Covey's than in the last 6. The circumstances leading to the change in Mr. Covey's course toward me form an epoch in my humble history. You've seen how a man was made a slave. You shall see how a slave was made a man. On one of the hottest days of the month of August 1833, Bill Smith, William Hughes, a slave named Eli, and myself were engaged in fanning wheat. Hughes was clearing the fanned wheat from before the fan. Eli was turning, Smith was feeding, and I was carrying wheat to the fan. The work was simple, requiring strength rather than intellect, yet, to one entirely unused to such work, it came very hard. About 3 o'clock of that day I broke down. My strength failed me. I was seized with a violent aching of the head, attended with extreme dizziness. I trembled in every step. Finding what was coming, I nerved myself up, feeling it would never do to stop work. I stood as long as I could stagger to the hopper with grain. When I could stand no longer, I fell, and felt as if held down by an immense weight. The fan, of course, stopped. Everyone had his own work to do, and no one could do the work of the other and have his own go on at the same time. Mr. Covey was at the house, about 100 yards from the treading yard where we were fanning. On hearing the fan stop, he left immediately and came to the spot where we were. He hastily inquired what the matter was. Bill answered that I was sick, and that there was no one to bring the wheat to the fan. I had by this time crawled under away the side of the post and rail fence by which the yard was enclosed, hoping to find relief by getting out of the sun. He then asked where I was. He was told by one of the hands. He came to the spot, and after looking at me for a while, asked me what was the matter. I told him as well as I could, for I scarce had the strength to speak. He then gave me a savage kick in the side and told me to get up. I tried to do so, but fell back in the attempt. He gave me another kick and again told me to rise. I again tried and succeeded in gaining my feet, but stooping to get the tub with which I was feeding the fan, I again staggered and fell. While down in this situation, Mr. Covey took up the hickory slat with which Hughes had been striking off the half-bushel measure, and with it gave me a heavy blow upon the head, making a large wound, and the blood ran freely. And with this again told me to get up. I made no effort to comply, having now made up my mind to let him do his worst. In a short time, after receiving this blow, my head grew better. Mr. Covey had now left me to my fate. At this moment, I resolved for the first time to go to my master, enter a complaint, and ask his protection. In order to do this, I must that afternoon walk 7 miles, and this, under the circumstances, was truly a severe undertaking. I was exceedingly feeble, made so as much by the kicks and blows which I received, as by the severe fit of sickness to which I had been subjected. I, however, watched my chance, while Covey was looking in the opposite direction, and started for St. Michael's. I succeeded in getting a considerable distance on my way to the woods, when Covey discovered me, and called after me to come back, threatening what he would do if I did not come. I disregarded both his calls and his threats, and made my way to the woods as fast as my feeble state would allow, and thinking I might be overhauled by him if I kept the road, I walked through the woods, keeping far enough from the road to avoid detection, and near enough to prevent losing my way. I had not gone far before my little strength again failed me. I could go no farther. I fell down and lay for a considerable time. The blood was yet oozing from the wound on my head. For a time I thought I should bleed to death, and think now that I should have done so, but that the blood so matted my hair as to stop the wound. After lying there about 3/4 of an hour, I nerved myself up again and started on my way through bogs and briars, barefooted and bareheaded, tearing my feet sometimes at nearly every step, and after a journey of about 7 miles, occupying some 5 hours to perform it, I arrived at Master's store. I then presented an appearance enough to affect any but a heart of iron. From the crown of my head to my feet, I was covered with blood. My hair was all clotted with dust and blood. My shirt was stiff with blood. My legs and feet were torn in sundry places with briars and thorns, and were also covered with blood. I supposed I looked like a man who had escaped a den of wild beasts, and barely escaped them. In this state, I appeared before my master, humbly entreating him to interpose his authority for my protection. I told him all the circumstances as well as I could, and it seemed, as I spoke, at times to affect him. He would then walk the floor and seek to justify Covey by saying he expected I deserved it. Then he asked me what I wanted. I told him to let me get a new home, that as sure as I lived with Mr. Covey again, I should live with but to die with him, that Covey would surely kill me. He was in a fair way for it. Master Thomas ridiculed the idea that there was any danger of Mr. Covey killing me, and said that he knew Mr. Covey, that he was a good man, and that he could not think of taking me from him, that, should he do so, he would lose the whole year's wages, that I belonged to Mr. Covey for 1 year, and that I must go back to him, come what might, and that I must not trouble him with any more stories, or that he should himself get a hold of me. After threatening me thus, he gave me a very large dose of salts, telling me that I might remain in St. Michael's that night, it being quite late, but that I must be off back to Mr. Covey's early in the morning, and that if I did not, he would get a hold of me, which meant he would whip me. I remained all night, and according to his orders I started off to Covey's in the morning, Saturday morning, wearied in body and broken in spirit. I got no supper that night, or breakfast that morning. I reached Covey's about 9 o'clock, and just as I was getting over the fence that divided Mrs. Kemper's fields from ours, out ran Covey with his cowskin to give me another whipping. Before he could reach me, I succeeded in getting to the cornfield, and as the corn was very high, it afforded me the means of hiding. He seemed very angry and searched for me a long time. My behavior was altogether unaccountable. He finally gave up the chase, thinking, I suppose, that I must come home for something to eat. He would give himself no further trouble in looking for me. I spent that day mostly in the woods, having the alternative before me to go home and be whipped to death, or stay in the woods and be starved to death. That night I fell in with Sandy Jakins, a slave with whom I was somewhat acquainted. Sandy had a free wife who lived about 4 miles from Mr. Covey's, and it being Sunday, he was on his way to see her. I told him my circumstances, and he very kindly invited me to go home with him. I went home with him, and talked this whole matter over, and got his advice as to what course it was best for me to pursue. I found Sandy an old adviser. He told me with great solemnity I must go back to Covey, but that before I went, I must go with him into another part of the woods, where there was a certain root, which, if I would take some of it with me, carrying it always on my right side, would render it impossible for Mr. Covey or any other white man to whip me. He said he had carried it for years, and since he had done so, he had never received a blow, and never expected to while he carried it. I at first rejected the idea that simply carrying of the root in my pocket would have any such effect as he had said, and was not disposed to take of it, but Sandy impressed the necessity with much earnestness, telling me it could do no harm if it did no good. To please him, at length I took the root, and according to his direction, carried it upon my right side. This was Sunday morning.